The last thing you're going to learn about in this class is adding harmonies to melody. Now, in this case, we're going to be specifically talking about adding triads to melodies. So, if you look in your book, you'll see a chart that describes progressive and retrogressive motion. And I'm not going to write it on the board, but I will play what it means and we can talk about it. We can write it out. If we are going progressively, we'll go down by fifths from the tonic. And so if we're going progressively, we're going down by fifths from the tonic. And of course, going retrogressively, we would just go in the opposite direction. So let me play each chord progression so that you can hear the difference. Here's a retrogressive chord progression. It doesn't have a great sense of direction, and that's why it's called retrogressive. Now let's hear the progressive chord progression. Hopefully you could hear that second chord progression had a sense of forward motion, moving toward the end. So a lot of composers and songwriters keep this in mind when they're harmonizing a melody, because they realize as they get toward the end of a phrase, they want to go in progressive motion. And maybe at the beginning, they want to go in retrogressive motion just so it doesn't feel like there's a great sense of urgency. I'll explain more about what I mean as we go along. But we don't have to do all this. Another way to think about it is to think that different chords within a key have different jobs to do. And that's probably the easiest way for you as fundamental students to think about it. So, usually we think about the tonic as being sort of like home base. So, if I just wanted to hang out on one chord all day, it would be the tonic. But of course, music is pretty meaningless when there's no tension. So in order to have our home mean something, we have to leave our home. And then eventually, we need something that's going to lead us back to our home. And usually, the dominant especially, and sometimes the leading tone, they lead us to our home. So usually when we want to go back to our home, we first go to a dominant. Every once in a while, a 4 chord. Most commonly though, this chord right here gives us the sense of urgency that we're going home now. The 2 chord and the 4 chord are what we call predominants. Now, you may have heard people talk about 3-chord songs that just have 3 chords in them. Well, in order to have a sensible chord progression that one can follow, all you really need is a 1 chord, a 4 chord, and a 5 chord. You could just go like this all day. I'm sure you've heard lots of songs that just use those 3 chords, 1, 4, and 5. I heard several on the radio while I was driving here today. But, you know, sometimes we like a little more variety. And so we could substitute a 2 chord for a 4 chord. And then, of course, there are other chords we haven't mentioned. 6 chords can sometimes be used as a substitute for 1 chord if you want to change things up a little bit. Here's my 6th chord. And the 3 chord also can serve as filler. The 7 chord, other than sometimes using it as a dominant, we really avoid it because it's a diminished chord. Now right now we're talking about major keys. This is a little different for minor keys, but not much. The only difference would be in a minor key, you might substitute the 3 chord for 1. And really the reason for these substitutions is because major key is the relative minor. And in a minor key, the 3 chord is the relative major. So they have a nice relationship, and that's why sometimes they fill in for each other. But other than that, this is the same for any key. So when you go to harmonize a melody, you know most of the time you're going to hang out around 1. When you want to get away, you go to some other chord. Then when you're getting toward the end of your phrase, you need a predominant and then a dominant. That's the first thing to know about harmonizing. But then there's more to it than that, because sometimes these chords don't work exactly like how you want them to with the actual melody you're trying to harmonize. So we'll get to that next by using an actual melody and adding harmonies to it. So now let's practice harmonizing a melody. And follow along with me, because there are steps that you should follow, and if you do so, you'll do a great job. So the first thing we need to do is look at our melody and determine what key it's in. So first let's look at our key signature. What are our options for this key signature? Could be D major, could be B minor. We're not sure. Our next step is to look at the last note. It ends on a D. It's probably D major. It starts on a D. Okay, it's probably D major. Now the next thing I like to do is see, okay, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 measures. Look at the end of the first 4 measures. Does that look like maybe there's a phrase there? It does. And the reason I know that is that I have a long note here. And normally when I come to the end of a phrase, there's a pause, like a longer note that's held as we slightly pause before we go on to the second half of our period or the next phrase, whatever it might be. So I know this could be a period or it could just be 2 phrases. Well, to figure out if it's a period, let's think. In D major, what would a 5 chord have? It would have A, C sharp, and E. We end on an F sharp here. So this is probably not a period. But at the same time, I know that I probably don't want to end really strongly right here, because if I do, I'm not going to feel like going on to the end. So there are just things like that to keep in mind. Kind of analyze your melody before you begin.